Hi, it's Timothy McCall. I wanted to tell you about an upcoming workshop I'm going to be teaching on the Vinyasa of breath. Now, the Vinyasa of breath is a style of practicing that I've come up with that, as the name suggests, is about moving in and out of poses, very much tied to the breath. And the breath is done particularly slowly and with subtlety in this system. Now, I have to say, I never thought I would be someone who would invent his own system of yoga. That was never my intention. I never set out to do that. But a few months ago, it occurred to me that that's what happened, that I, in fact, had done that. And now I have been looking at anatomy in a more holistic way than is typically taught in yoga teacher training programs, and certainly much more holistic than I learned in medical school. So a kind of way of viewing anatomy that looks at not just parts of the body and small parts of the body, but the way that different parts of the body interact with each other. And particularly, I came in my own practice to focus more and more on the bones. Now, the way we've been taught to view anatomy is to think about parts of bones, like about the lesser trochanter, the femur, for example, and which muscles attach to there, and where do those muscles originate, and what are the actions on the various joints. And it becomes this study of incredible minutia. And yoga teachers, of course, read so much, take so many courses on anatomy, but it's all very much, or almost all very much, this kind of reductionist anatomy, analyzing the effects of individual muscles on joints and what impact on joint movement the contraction of a particular muscle has, and how perhaps that might change when the angle of the joint is changed. And it's kind of an endless amount of information that's almost impossible to ever really get your hands totally around, because it's just so intricate and involved, and sometimes so hard to visualize how this stuff all works. But the good news is, and what I've discovered and what's really led me to come up with this system, is that it's possible to go very deep into anatomical alignment without knowing any of that stuff. All you need to do is know what individual bones, like this femur bone, look like, and then imagining these bones not moving small parts of them, but the whole bone. What actions do these bones have? And how do these bones interact with the next bone up and down in the kinetic chain? And to really start thinking of the body holistically as this structure, kind of like a geodesic dome, where all the struts, the bones, interact with each other in this dynamic way that distributes forces and protects any particular part of the structure from getting too much stress. So now, the word that Buckminster Fuller, the inventor of the geodesic dome, used to describe his geodesic domes was tensegrity. It's a made-up word that brings tension or tensional together with the word integrity. And now this kid's toy is actually a tensegrity structure. And one of the things you'll notice is that the bones, so to speak, the struts of this structure, the primary weight-bearing elements of this structure, none of them touch each other. Instead, they kind of float between these different elastic cords. And this, I believe, is a better metaphor to understand how human bodies actually work than reductionist analysis of individual muscles and joints as levers and fulcrum and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that doesn't have any value, but I think that surprisingly, when you start to take the telescope out a few notches, so to speak, and get a more global view of the body, it allows you to go deep into awareness of alignment and be able to manipulate with your mind and your visualizations and subtle movements how the bones align with each other and how they interact with each other in a way that really makes the poses spring to life. One thing you'll notice about this tensegrity structure, kind of like a geodesic dome or a suspension bridge or even a bicycle wheel, can all be thought of as tensegrity structures, is that the weight-bearing elements don't touch each other, and because there's this kind of elastic or compressible or stretchable material in between, when you put an external force on a tensegrity structure, it deforms. In other words, it changes shape, but then as soon as you remove the force, it springs back to its original shape. Now, and I think that this is what we're looking for in our yoga practice. We want to have poses that are lightly held, that have a kind of springiness, a pliability to them. If poses are held too rigidly, you lose that pliability, and I think you increase your risk of injury. And one of the things I've discovered as I've practiced in this softer, less demanding way on my body is that I hardly ever get all those little tweaks and strains that I was continually getting in all my years of yoga practice. Now, the two major influences on my yoga practice are, first of all, Iyengar yoga, which I practiced for about 15 years. But because I was the medical editor of Yoga Journal, I was also making the study of yoga and yoga therapy my professional work. And even though I practiced Iyengar yoga, I kind of studied everything because I really wanted to bring an ecumenical perspective to my work and not be simply an advocate of a particular system. Now, what's happened in the last 5 years is that I found myself returning to something I first really got exposed to around 2001 when I met TKV Deskachar first at a Yoga Journal conference in Colorado, and then I went the next winter and spent a couple of weeks at the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram in Chennai, Madras, India. I could tell, even though it wasn't the style of yoga I practiced or planned to practice, I could tell it was a very deep system. Now, what I've found in the last 5 years or so is I've really gone back to this style of yoga, sometimes called Vini yoga, sometimes just named after Deskachar or being influenced by Deskachar, or Krishnamacharya, of course, was Deskachar's father. Or some people have studied with A.G. Mohan, another yoga master who I had the good fortune to spend some time with when I was in India. So, in any case, if you practice this kind of yoga with me, you'll notice that some of what I do very much looks like Vini yoga, but I no longer focus on individual muscles. I hardly think about muscles that much in my practice. I mean, of course, I know all that kind of anatomy, learned it in med school, learned it in yoga teacher training. But the fact is that I tend to, instead of that, visualize the actions of the bones and the way the bones work with each other, and find that rather than kind of ordering my body to contract a particular muscle the way I kind of did for years, instead now I make a suggestion to the body of where I would like it to move, and this is a system, yoga, vinyasa system, where we really do move in and out of poses. And I let my body figure out which muscles to use. Now, this has a bunch of advantages. One is it takes you out of that kind of left brain, hyper-conceptual way of practicing, which I believe takes you away from actually experiencing the yoga as fully. You're too much in your mind and not enough into feeling and experiencing and noticing. I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive, and I'm not saying that other way of practicing is a bad way. I did it for years and got all kinds of benefits. But this is a way that I found that paradoxically, even though it feels like I'm not trying as hard, that I go more deeply into poses. I go more deeply into anatomical alignment. It's more calming, more nourishing feeling. Quiets the mind more. And it takes me out, as I was saying, of that kind of hyper-conceptual way of approaching asana. Instead, makes it a more intuitive and more perceptive way of approaching practice. This has transformed the way I do my own practice. It's transformed the way I practice yoga therapy. It's transformed the way I teach yoga. And it's transformed the way some of my students practice as well. So I'm really jazzed about this material, and I hope you'll give it a chance. It may be quite different from what you've learned before, depending on who your teachers have been and how you've gone about your practice. But I think it's something that really might speak to you and perhaps even change the way you practice going forward. I hope you'll think about joining us. Would love to see you. Take good care. Namaste.